So good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started, and there may be some people in Zoom world. Hello, welcome to you. Not yet? Okay. We hope to record this as well so that you can access it off the website at a later time. So this morning we are really privileged to have Dr. Stephen Lloyd Moffett from Cal Poly as our guest speaker for Justice Sunday. He's affectionately known, I understand, as Prof. Moff. He has an extensive background educationally in religious studies, and he also, through the course of his career, has become an expert on a variety of topics that may or may not fall under the purview of religious studies, but which are nonetheless very enlightening to know. And so we've always enjoyed you being here. We will ask that you hold questions till the end, and part of that is because we want to let the thing flow logically, but also we will ask that we do questions on the mic so that it gets recorded. So without further ado, Dr. Stephen Lloyd Moffett.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Is that too loud? Loud? Good. Okay. On the most faithful day of the year, I think more non-churchgoers pray during the Super Bowl than on almost any other day. And I appreciate you having so many different perspectives here on Justice Sundays. I understand my colleague Farid and people came last month, which is always an enlightening idea. Let's see here, we'll get this going. There we go. Oh, come on. Oh, we had it working so well. Oh, there we go. So when I founded religious studies here at Cal Poly as a minor program, we chose as our theme, understanding leads to convivencia. Convivencia was a time where Jews, Muslims, and Christians got along and supported each other in Spain. And we thought, it's better to sort of encourage each other in their faith walk. And that will lead to peace, and that peace from the beginning has always been in Arabic, in Hebrew, and in English. So we are at the understanding phase of this, where I'm hoping to provide the background between the conflict, because for so many people, it's just avoiding talking about it because they know it's super complicated and it is super passionate. And to have some sort of background hopefully will provide you with some comfort to have meaningful conversations. I also begin with my background here. I lived in Israel in 1994. I was studying Orthodox monks, Greek Orthodox monks, so I lived in a monastery in Jerusalem. I happened to actually, though, be in Tel Aviv on one of the Hamas's first big bus bombs. I had gone into Tel Aviv to watch a movie because I'd been away from the States a long time. The movie was Speed, and kid you not, I walked out, and the exit of the theater happened to be a block from where an actual bus bomb had gone off. And throughout my time, Hamas was blowing up buses, which is the main way through. When I eventually came back and did my PhD in early Christianity and early Hinduism, I inevitably ended up studying Judaism and then eventually studying Islam. And when I came to Cal Poly, we started off a course on religion and politics in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which when we proposed the course back in 2006, the curriculum committee said, do you think this should be a special topics? Because is it still going to be relevant in a few years? Do we need an actual course? And I said, yeah, I'm pretty sure. This will still be relevant in a decade's time. And I've continued to teach that, and I'm currently teaching it now. And I co-teach it with a political scientist. So let's start off the beginning. Both groups that we're talking about, the Jews, the Israelites, and the Palestinians, both arrive into the land around the same time. who was living at the land was the Canaanites. So when people say, hey, let's just give it back to the original people, let's find the Canaanites and just pass it off the Canaanites. So they both come around the same time. Israel, of course, is in the land from about 1200 BCE to 136 CE. Series of temples are built in Jerusalem, but they have a mixed history during the time, where eventually they are conquered by the Babylonians, by the Greeks, or by the Persians, by the Greeks, and then eventually the Romans, where we get to our critical moment. They revolt in 66 of the Common Era, and the temple is destroyed, which it's still destroyed. But it leads us to an important moment. In 132, the biggest rabbi of the era, a guy named Akiva, announces that the Messiah has been identified, a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba. The role of the Messiah was to raise up the Jews against oppression, and he successfully revolts against the Romans in 132. He establishes the third kingdom of Israel, prints coins and has a real country. But just a spoiler alert, Romans don't like it when you revolt. And so the Romans decide we have had it with the Jews revolting. And so in 135, they kick the Israelites out of the ancestral land. They ban the use of the term Israel. It will be now known as Palestine. They kill some 600 rabbis on a single day. And this begins an era in Jewish history known as the diaspora, which is the era in which the Jews are away from their ancestral land. And the land is, we'll follow up on that story, but the land becomes a dominant Christian land eventually, and then eventually a dominant Muslim land. So the era of the diaspora is from 135, when they're kicked out of their ancestral land, until the 19th century. And there's actually very little concrete movement to return to that land. For the most part, they are living among non-Jews in their land. Of course, the dominant experience in the diaspora was persecution. Persecution largely by Christians, to a lesser extent by Muslims, but mostly they were never allowed to be citizens, never allowed to have autonomy in their land, and they were often kicked out of that land. What changed? Well, to understand what changed in Judaism was the rise of nationalism. In the 18th and 19th century, Europeans said, we don't need kingdoms anymore, we want nations. We want nations where we will join together as a group of people simply because we want to create a nation together, not because God granted a kingdom, not because of these things. And so you begin to see France emerge, and Germany emerge, and Italy. You see all these places, America emerges. And there were certain Jews who had said, well, if France can have a nation and they don't share religion, they don't share a history, shouldn't we have a nation too? And so that's what Zionism is. Zionism began as a term at the end of the 19th century, so it's a modern term. And it's only the desire to have a place where Jews have self-autonomy and self-determination. And this becomes important, that the term Zionism just means a place where Jews can be free of persecution and free of external influence. And so if you say you're anti-Zionist, what you're saying is Jews are the only group in the world who should not have a place where they can control their own destiny. Because there are dozens of Christian nations, there's dozens of Muslim nations, there's a dozen Buddhist nations, and when you say you're anti-Zionist, all you're saying is, nope, Jews are different and they do not deserve to have the same privileges that other people have. Now, Zionism has been connected to the ancestral land, to a desire to return there. That's where Zion is. Zion are the hills around Jerusalem. But in the early period, it really wasn't limited to that. People had talked about having it in Argentina or Paraguay, or even there was talk of Montana and Alberta, just some place where the Jews could be free of persecution. Now, at the end of the 19th century, when this desire comes up because of nationalism, many of the Reformed Jews of the period were like, no, if God wanted us to return to this land, he would have made it happen over the last 1900 years. We don't want to return to that land. Orthodox Jews, kind of the other extreme, also weren't really supportive of returning to the ancestral land because they said, this seems like a very human endeavor. And if God wants us to return to that land, God should make it happen. So Zionism really did not have a lot of support in the Jewish world until you get to World War II. And the debate about whether the Jews needed a place to be free of the threat of persecution is settled with the Holocaust. Now, in Jewish circles, the term we use is Shoah. Shoah just means the catastrophe, because a Holocaust in traditional worlds is an offering for past sins. And so many Jews say, wow, how is 6 million Jews dying connected to past sins? That's an inappropriate use of the term, and so in Judaism, the term is Shoah. It's just a catastrophe. It's just a catastrophe. So what happens? The UN recognizes that the debate on whether Jews need a place free of persecution is now settled. Jews need a place free of persecution. And the most natural place is, after World War II, there's an entire shuffling of the Middle East. All these countries are being made from nothing. And they say, okay, well, let's create a country for the Jews and a country for the non-Jews in that area. If you see, the original plan was for the Jews to have the areas in orange there. And it did not include the biblical heartland, where most of the Bible stories go. But most of the Jews sort of pushing for this new state really were quite secular, were just thinking, we need a place to be free of persecution. This is kind of around the ancestral area, even if it doesn't include the sort of biblical heartland of the West Bank. Interestingly, it was just called the Jewish state up until 2 weeks before the independence, and then someone suggested calling it Israel, which seems so natural to us now, and it seems weird to think of it, just in all the planning documents, it was just called the Jewish state in it. And eventually, independence is declared. Now, what happens to the population that was there? Well, it's the Jews are kicked out in 135. It becomes a pagan or Greek religion. Then eventually the Roman Empire becomes Christian. Eventually the Islamic armies come in. And it sort of gets lost within the wider Islamic empires for most of its history. The term Palestine kind of fades around the 13th century. It starts being called different things, the subject of Jerusalem. So Palestine as a term kind of fades over time. The population becomes more mixed as a part of these bigger Abbasid empires, Ottoman empires all come in, and it sort of just becomes a part of a wider empire. Well, after World War II, the UN says we are going to create these two nations, a Palestinian nation and an Israeli nation. And the Palestinians were like, let me follow the logic here. The Germans mistreated the Jews, so you take our land? Like, why don't you give the Jews Germany? Like, why? I mean, we can recognize that Jews have been mistreated, but why do we bear the responsibility? And so the existing population said no, and the Arabs around them said hell no. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't say that in a church. Sorry, forgive me. Said no, and they start a war right away to reject this plan. Now, the Arab countries promised a lot of things to support the Palestinians. You'll see in this story, the Arab nations never support the Palestinians except for verbally, and the Arab nations did not show up at all. I mean, let's give you an example. The Saudis had promised 40,000 troops. 2.5 years into it, they had sent 800. When Jordan was on the eastern flank of this war, they heard that the Egyptians were coming up from the south to take over Gaza. They reach out to the Israelis and say, take Gaza for yourself or give it to Satan, as long as you don't give it to the Egyptians. And so the Arab armies were horrible at fighting and supporting the Palestinians, and they lost. That in Arab history, that is called the Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic. And so what you see is the Jewish catastrophe led to the rise of this new nation claimed, and that led to a war, which led to the Palestinian catastrophe. There's just a lot of catastrophe going around. Now, the early years of Israel were filled with great promise. Israel had not had a nation since 135. They were like, we can do this better than other nations because we have learned from this. So they start a new movement called the kibbutz movement, which we're going to try to live collectively. We're going to try to live close to the earth. They choose as their flag the Star of David because the hope is Israel will be an enlightened nation. So what happens? Arabs want to avenge the loss of 1948. And so in 1967, the Arab armies decide that they are going to simultaneously attack Israel. And in numbers, Israel is doomed because the Arab armies have just so much bigger population. And so this is looking like a nightmare in 1967. But what happens? In 1967, in May, the Israelis preemptively attack all their neighbors. They wipe out almost the entire air forces of all the surrounding nations all in one morning. And when you fight a war in the desert, when you control the air, you can control the land. And so Israel wins against all their neighbors in 6 days, thus the 6 Days War. Military historians will say this is one of the greatest military victories in all of history. But it also meant that Israel tripled the size of its country. It was now in functional control of Sinai, which they get from Egypt. So they get Gaza and Sinai in this. They also, importantly for religious Jews, they get the West Bank. That's the biblical heartland. That is where all the stuff happens in the Bible. Tel Aviv does not exist in the Bible. And so for religious Jews, they finally are in control of the biblical heartland. Now, this sets up the basic dilemma, because when Israel is founded, they are founded on 3 principles. They're going to be a Jewish nation, that is, of all the countries in the world, there will be one Jewish nation, and that will be Israel. They are going to be democratic in style, and they aspire to be the full size of ancient Israel. Prior to 1967, they were a Jewish nation, democratic in style. They were not the full size of ancient Israel. After 1967, they're the full size of ancient Israel and more. But it sets up a problem, because on that land are millions of Palestinians who are not Jewish. And so this sets up the primary dilemma. How can you have all 3 of these? Because if you want to be a Jewish nation, the full size of ancient Israel, and yet there's millions of Palestinians living on the land, you can't be democratic because they would outvote you. If you want to be a Jewish nation and democratic in style, you can't be the full size of ancient Israel. If you want to be democratic and in style and the full size of ancient Israel, then you won't be Jewish. And so this has been the problem behind the Middle East in this area from 1967. There's no way to solve this. If Israel wants to be a Jewish nation that is democratic in style and the full size of ancient Israel, you can't have all 3 of those. And this has been the struggle ever since, because there's no way to solve for this. So what has happened? Well, the Arabs regroup once again on October 6, 1973. They're like, hey, it's a Yom Kippur, the holiest day. They will be unprepared and will have a sneak attack. It actually works for a little while. It ends up sort of backfiring, because instead of having to find everybody in their house, everybody's in the synagogue. So they just called all the synagogues and said, hey, all men and women who are fighting, go. And so eventually Israel wins that Yom Kippur War. But notice the date, October 6th. That becomes symbolic, because 50 years later, that is when the attacks start. So what happens? From 67 to 2007, there is a basic struggle. Should they integrate the Palestinians and the Israeli economies as people, like, hey, let's all work together because this is a small area and our fate economically is dependent upon each other? Should we sort of exist side by side, just sort of coexist with each other? Or should we separate and try to sort of isolate from each other? And this is, different sort of trends happen in these three options. The US almost always wants to try to create peace. And so you see this in the Camp David Accords. You see this in the Oslo Accords. And then usually those accords break down because of what political scientists call the extremist veto. And that is, even if the vast majority of people want a peace, somebody who doesn't usually can do something so horrific that it destabilizes the whole peace attempts and it breaks it down. So let's look at this in terms of 1993 and the Oslo Accord. So there are those on both sides who are practical and say, we're not going to get everything we want, but maybe we can sort of move towards getting some of what we want and at least have peace. And then there's always the absolute idealist who, if you're a religious Jew who thinks that God gave you this land, we deserve all of it. If you're a Palestinian, we want to get rid of all the Jews in the area and have everything. Well, Oslo was about the winning of the realists. The Oslo Accord said, hey, neither side is getting everything we want, but we're going to trade the ideal, but for peace. That was the plan. Well, then what happened after 93 when everybody was pretty darn hopeful about peace? Well, the extremists came in. You see on the Jewish side, you saw the prime minister who made peace get assassinated. You see a Jewish terrorist attack against Muslims praying in Hebron. And internally politically, one of the most hated figures among the Palestinians, Jewish leaders among the Palestinians, Ariel Sharon, he starts realizing that he can stoke a lot of anger and destabilize the whole peace process. So this also then leads to with Sharon, the rise of settlements. And settlements are Jews who move into the West Bank, the biblical heartland. And every time a Jewish group moved into the heartland, the same pattern happened. Basically, Palestinians say, wait, you're just stealing our land and you had promised it. And the Palestinians respond, Jews respond. Your first job as a country is to make sure your people are safe. The Israeli government puts in protective forces for the settlements. That creates more Palestinian anger, and you just get this cycle of anger driven by settlers who are absolute idealists. They're like, no, we're going to take this whole land. So that destabilized the peace in the area. On the Palestinian side, the architects of peace were Hamas. So Hamas emerges in the 1980s. When the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which were at that point headquartered in Lebanon, Israel attacks Lebanon to kick the PLO out. The PLO ends up in Tunisia at a resort, totally separated from their people. And in that vacuum, you see Hamas arise. And Hamas, it was inspired by an Egyptian religious movement called the Muslim Brotherhood. They are the Muslim Brotherhood of the Palestinian territory, so they were connected to a group in Egypt. And their charter from the very beginning was the elimination of all Jews in the region. So they have never wanted two states, they have never wanted a single Jew left in it, and in their original charter, they said, we as Muslims have an obligation to kill all Jews in this area. So Hamas was the extremist veto of the Palestinian side, and their whole vision was to scuttle peace so that Muslims would rule this entire area and Israel would be destroyed. That was their lane. So what happens? America has a common pattern for making peace in the area when two parties that distrust each other. We will exchange land for peace. So with Egypt, Israel will give back Sinai in exchange for peace. No one trusts each other, so the US pays both of them to trust each other. Our two biggest external aids are Egypt and Israel, and that's been the deal. Without trust, America just buys off peace, and we pay both sides not to hurt each other. In 2005, though, this basic pattern of land for peace was surprisingly done by that really antagonistic guy, Ariel Sharon, and he said, I am just going to give the Palestinians Gaza. And I'm going to do this because Gaza is not part of the biblical heartland. None of his party cares about Gaza. There's very few resources in Gaza. And so he says, look, I am going to show the international community my goodwill. We will just pass Gaza to the Palestinians, and they will demonstrate to the world what a great government they are. But what happened? Well, there's an election in 2006 because President Bush really believes in democracy, and the people of Palestine vote in Hamas, this extremist veto group who are trying to scuttle any peace options. Fatah, which is the remnants of the PLO, is in the West Bank, and a civil war begins within the Palestinians. So in 2007, there's almost 1,000 Palestinians killed by other Palestinians because they cannot agree on who should lead them as a people. And the result of that civil war is Hamas ends up being in complete control of Gaza, and Fatah, or the Palestinian National Authority, is in control of the West Bank. There's been so many attempts to try to create a unity government, but they hate each other as much as they hate Israel. Israel says, well, here's a group that is within 30 miles of our most populous city, like Tel Aviv to the West Bank, so close. In their charter, they are explicitly for the elimination of all Jews in the period. They quote the Protocols of Zion, this made-up anti-Semitic text, in their thing. Well, we cannot allow them to have a government here. We can't allow them to build up. In America, if you remember back in 2005, we're still in that George Bush anti-terrorism, you're with us against this, and Hamas was not just didn't renounce terrorism, they advocated for terrorism as a tech. So Israel begins the blockade of Gaza in 2007 with the hope that conditions will get so bad in Gaza that the citizens of Gaza will throw Hamas out and allow the Palestinian National Authority, Fatah, to take control. So then what happens? Well, ever since 2007, there's been a sort of pattern that has taken place. And there have been now 5 wars between Israel and Hamas. And so we as scholars can learn about why these wars start, because it's been 5 times in the last 16 years. So when does conflict start? Well, there's a very simple rubric to look at this. At any given moment, there are 3 options. There is peace, there is the status quo, or there's war. And when we look at the last 16 years, we like to look at it through this sort of lens of why did the incentives lead to a peace movement? Why did the incentives lead to doing nothing? And when did they lead to war? And when you look at that analysis, there's 2 kind of aspects. There is the internal politics you need to look at, like what's going on in Israeli internal politics, like the prime minister and the parties, or what's going on in the Palestinian internal politics. And then there's the external pressures, like US elections play a big role in this. And the Arab Spring played a big role, and what Saudi Arabia's attempt to integrate into the world political order. I mean, all those sort of things. And so, when we look at we look at the wars since 2007, we can sort of analyze and say what led to those, and this will help us understand what what Hamas was thinking on October 7th. Now, so October 7th, after several years of really not showing much resistance to Israel, suddenly they coordinate a massive attack that no one in Israel thought Hamas was capable of. I don't think Hamas was prepared for how successful they were. I think they thought they were just going to kill some border guards, but they went all the way through and massacred 1,200 people and horrifically killing many, many people, raping people, and going through the process. So why did they do it October 7th? Like, what was their thought process? And this is what's consumed me since October 7th. Like, what were they thinking was going to happen? Like, why do this attack now? Like, I mean, obviously they knew Israel was going to respond. So what was their thinking? So what I want to do is try to do 5 reasons why Hamas attacked. So first, if you look at Hamas's resistance against the occupation, they are never going to win this battle on the battlefield. Militarily, there is no way they're going to compete with the Israeli army, right? So they have no ability to win this through force. Their only pathway to autonomy and end of occupation is international pressure on Israel. That is their only pathway. That is their only strategy. But what's happened in the last 17 years? Most of the world has just thrown up their arms and said, you two deserve each other. Like, I mean, you're just like, there is no peace. And we can statistically look at this, that if you just look at headlines in the New York Times, in the 2000s, it was almost every single New York Times had at least one story on the issue. 2010s, you get every other, every third. In the last 3 years, it just, I mean, and nobody's even trying to make peace. I mean, Trump tried this sort of silly Abraham Accords thing that lasted about 3 days because everybody was like, that's ridiculous. But there's just no real attempts to make peace. And so Hamas needed to remind the international community of the occupation and try to get them to put pressure on Israel to change the status quo. Now, massacring 1,200 people is going to get news. Their whole premise, though, was people will quickly forget about October the 7th and start criticizing Israel's response. And so they said, we can do this sort of bad press October 7th because it is going to elicit a response that will be so horrific that the international community will start talking about the occupation again. And now that we've been into this for 4 months, we can sort of look and say, you know what? They're right. They were right on that. It did exactly according to Hamas's plan. Suddenly now, there are protests again that are pro-Palestinians. There haven't been real protests in a decade, really, on it. If you look at even social media, this is one of the few studies. Right after October 7th, it was sort of mixed, but now suddenly social media ends up being way, way pro-Palestinian. If you look at the international, this is a error perception of America, that's really gone down. So if Hamas wanted to elevate the conditions of the Palestinians, their plan was do something that elicits such a horrific response that the response will become the story. And the international community will put pressure on Israel. And so people are like, oh, this is such a horrific war that Israel's going. And it is horrific for sure, but it is what Hamas wanted. Hamas wanted the response. They need the response because that is their pathway to autonomy. Okay, second of all, one of the things Hamas has learned is that their internal support of their people is really precarious. Now, they will say the reason why we can't govern as a people is because of the blockade, right? If we had resources, we would be great at government. The reality is Hamas has turned into be just a bunch of gangsters who are really corrupt. But what they realize in each of these wars is when they attack Israel, there is a rally around the flag effect. Every single time, their internal support goes up between 10 and 20 points whenever they provoke Israel into a war. It's just a natural human thing when you're being attacked to rally around whoever is supporting you. I mean, George Bush's numbers went to, what, 92% approval rating after 9/11? I mean, it's unfathomable that either president, either party president would have that now, but what did America do? We rallied around when attacked. And here's the issue. Hamas has turned into be one of the most corrupt governments that we have. I mean, it is an absolute nightmare. Their two big leaders, most of their leaders are outside of Gaza. They're in Qatar, they're in Turkey. They have smuggled, by some reports, up to $3 billion into their personal bank accounts. Their children have many of their children have denounced them as just corrupt and left the whole movement. And for the first time, you began to see this summer mass protests against Hamas in Gaza by Palestinians saying, you don't represent us well. There was a poll done among the Gazans that finished October 6th, very convenient for us scholars, and it showed that 2/3 of Palestinians in Gaza had zero support for Hamas. So Hamas had lost the will of the people. There's no elections, so they weren't going to lose an election, but it meant when you had a supremely hostile self-population, their rule was precarious. But they realized if they provoke an attack, they knew October 7th was going to go attack, you get a rally around the flag, and you know what? They're right. Look at the approval rating before October 7th, and then look at it after the war. It went up 4 times. That's in the West Bank. It didn't go quite up as much in Gaza, but 98% of Palestinians feel pride in for being Palestinian after the massacre of Israeli citizens. So if they wanted to rally the citizens around the flag, success. Hamas knew that they were going to lose power because the people were so unhappy with them, and this is their way to stay in power, right? Raise it. Third, so the Palestinians have Hamas in Gaza, they have Fatah in the West Bank, but in the north of the West Bank, there's a group called the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Now, unlike Hamas, they have never aspired to being a government. They just want to be resistance. And they have really, honestly, not been very effective at resistance until somehow in the last year, they have gotten new uniforms, new weapons, and in the city of Jenin, they are finally being effective against Israel. So all summer, the talk about Israeli existence was in Jenin. And it wasn't Hamas, it was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who suddenly were looking sharp, were being effective against the IDF. They had become the face of resistance. And Hamas is sitting there in Gaza going, that's us. We're the face of the resistance. And you see Palestinians going, yeah, but you don't do anything. And Islamic Jihad is attacking troops. And so Hamas wanted to reclaim the mantle of we are the resistance against Israel. So, did it work? Look at September 23, 58% of people would have voted for Hamas to be a leader. Now, 6 weeks later, it's up to 78%. Can you imagine a political campaign who swings 20 percentage points in 6 weeks? Hamas, if there's an election, wins. They are now the face of the Palestinian resistance. So, again, check. Hamas got what they wanted out of the attack. Nobody is talking about Palestinian Islamic Jihad because of Gaza. Fourth, one really good thing Trump did in this debate was to put pressure on the UAE, to put pressure on Saudi Arabia, to put pressure on these really important Middle Eastern countries to normalize relations with Israel. That is a great plan, and all kudos to the Trump administration for making that happen. But the big kahuna here is Saudi Arabia. Because if Saudi Arabia normalizes relations with Israel, a whole bunch of Arab countries will follow suit. Not because Saudi Arabia is super important, economically it is, but symbolically, the floodgates will open once Saudi Arabia normalizes relationship. I would suspect in the next 6 months between 12 and 20 Arab countries normalizing relations after Saudi Arabia. That's the big kahuna. And Biden knows it. Biden has been working on Saudi Arabia since the moment he's been in office to try to normalize relations. And America's whole plan is always been the same. We'll just throw money. You know, if the Saudis normalize relations, we'll sell you a bunch of weapons. We'll give you a lot of money. That's our MO. But it would be worth it, you know, if we were to do that. September, rumors started coming out that the announcement had already been drafted. Saudis were going to normalize relationships. If that happened, Hamas is done. Because remember, Hamas's only plan is to get the international community to put pressure on Israel. And Hamas doesn't even recognize Israel's existence as a people, or, you know, claim that it can't exist. If they lose the backing of Saudi Arabia, which Saudi Arabia wouldn't sort of abandon the Palestinian people, but the whole argument of Hamas being that no Arab should ever recognize a Jewish state. Well, Saudi Arabia recognizes it, Hamas is done. So what do? Well, you provoke the attack, you attack Israel, knowing they're going to respond, because there's no way that Saudi Arabia is going to normalize relations when tens of thousands of Palestinians are dying. And so the Hamas knows the way to scuttle normalized relationship is to have Israel respond. How do you get Israel to respond? Go attack 1,200 innocent people. So, and then check. Hamas got what they wanted. You know, there's not talk right now of Saudi Arabia normalizing relations. Last thing. Hamas always is trying to take advantage of a situation. Israel has been, in the last 5 years, its most chaotic it's ever been internally. 5 elections in 3 years. Netanyahu keeps coming back to power, even though he is indicted on corruption charges again and again and again. He finally says, oh, well, you know, if the judges are going to indict me on corruption, well, let's just throw out the judges and change the law, and leading to massive protests, the biggest protests in Israeli history. And importantly, for the first time, you see Israeli reservists saying, I won't defend this government. Like, if attacked, I am not going to support this government. And so Hamas is like, weakness gives us our in. When the Israeli military is literally losing its people, like, let's take advantage of this. And we can destabilize Israel more, because the weaker Israel is, the more they will respond to international pressure, which again is Hamas's only strategy for gaining autonomy. And check, it works. Only 15% of Israelis want Netanyahu to keep their job. They blame him for everything. I mean, if their goal was to eliminate Netanyahu and destabilize Israel, it is destabilized. Now, I love there's this phrase that Netanyahu has been counted out so many times, and he keeps somehow pulling the rabbit out of the hat and getting back into power. In Israel, they say a cat in Israel has Netanyahu lives, because he just keeps on surviving. So when you look at Hamas, they attacked on October 7th because they wanted the international community to focus on the occupation again. They wanted to rally their internal support. They wanted to reassert themselves as the face of Israeli resistance. They wanted to scuttle any normalization by Saudi Arabia, and they wanted to exploit and encourage weakness in Israel. So why do people do terrorist attacks? Because they work. I mean, this has gone right to Hamas's plan, right? It has been exactly as they hoped would happen. So what are the sides doing? What does Israel want? Israel wants vengeance and retributive justice. I don't think we can hide that fact. Israelis are mad. Every Israeli knows at least one family who's had someone killed in it. I mean, to put it's just a horrific attack, and so many videos of just horrificness. Like, they want vengeance, but they want the kidnapped Israelis to get back. They want to contain Hamas's future. There was a big debate in 2021, 2022, even among Netanyahu's party. Is Hamas becoming normal? You know, do they want to somehow integrate into the international community and become a government? Or are they still going to be a guerrilla organization that just is driven by complete hatred, and that's no longer a debate. Hamas is never going to be normal. Like, they are never going to play that role, and so they can't be in power in Gaza. And then they want to remind neighbors like Hezbollah and other places that, okay, Israel's no longer weak. Look at what we do when we respond. But then there's a global anti-Semitism, and then a clear sort of double standard that when America fights back in Iraq and Afghanistan, we kill some 500,000 innocent people as a part of that, yet there's not a lot of, I mean, there was pushback among justice-oriented people, but the international community did not put a lot of pressure on America at the time, and yet the international community is putting a ton of pressure on Israel because of the innocents who are dying. What's Hamas's goal? Well, they need it to be a horrific war because their whole strategy is to rely on the sympathy of the international community. I react strongly when people say they use human shields. Human shields would suggest that they were trying to protect themselves from Israeli attack. No, they're sacrifices. They need women and children to die so that the international community gets really up in arms and puts pressure on Israel. So Hamas needs women and children to die. They know women and children are going to die, and they put them there in order to die so that there will be international pressure on them. And then they'll never win on an open battlefield with Israel, but they will win when they built tunnels, and they're the only ones who know where the tunnels are. So let's lure the IDF into the one environment where the asymmetrical warfare has less power. That is, when you're on your home turf and you've built tunnels and you've built defenses. So their idea is to lure IDF into it. So why has there been no peace? Everybody knows what the peace deal is going to be. The release of the hostages for peace and some promise towards two-state solution-y, something vague. That's what's going to happen. Everybody knows. Like, you don't have to have a PhD in political science to know what the peace deal ends up. So why isn't it happening? Hamas realizes if they give up their hostages, they have no leverage anymore, right? And would you trust Netanyahu? The answer is no. Nobody should trust Netanyahu. And so if they give the hostage up, Netanyahu is just going to go in again and totally eliminate them and do anything. So they can't give up their hostages. And they are, sort of playing this game to see how horrific can life be here that the international community puts any real pressure. Like, when will Biden actually put pressure on Israel to stop because it's so horrific? And so they need more horrificness in order to play this out. Netanyahu, there's Hamas, Netanyahu knows the minute the opposition won't call for elections during the war, most likely, depending on how long it goes, but the minute the war is done, the opposition is going to call for elections in Israel, and he is done. His political career is over. He positioned himself as, I'm the one who will keep you safe, and then under his watch, October 7th happened. Now, people have predicted Netanyahu's career being over so many times and been wrong, so maybe he can pull something out of a hat, but he knows his entire political career is over if he accepts a peace deal, unless he has overwhelming victory and he's seen as the one who created the victory. That's his only pathway to staying in power. And Netanyahu cares about one thing: staying in power. And so he is not going to accept a peace deal. He has no incentive politically to accept a peace deal unless it's perceived worldwide as being a total and complete victory for not Israel, for Netanyahu. So he's not going to accept a peace deal in it. Hamas isn't going to accept a peace deal because they can't give up the one thing they care about. And so there might be a pause in hostilities and give back women and children for a little bit, but Hamas is not gonna pass off too many. And so what's going to happen? Well, we're just going to have a lot of war. And there's going to be horrific civilian casualties, and Eventually, one side is going to give in, but I don't know what side that's going to be. But my final encouragement is, this is so complex that I tell my students, if a position can fit on a sign, it's not doing justice to the conflict. Like, just move beyond the protest signs. Oh, if a position can be put onto a protest sign, it does not do justice to the complexities behind it, right? I mean, it just is way more complicated than fits on a social media post or a sign. And so educating yourself about the conflict allows you to have a more nuanced perspective on it. And I do think understanding leads to an ability to live with each other, which will lead to peace. And I'll open up for questions in just one second, but I have to say I never thought that I would find myself quoting George W. Bush, but I think it's good to remember that he said, too often we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions. And I think when we look at this debate, no matter what side you're on, there is a tendency to see the worst in the other. And there's so much good on both sides that we hopefully will continue to try to honor. So with that, I'll open up to any questions you want. There's no dumb questions on this, and I'll do my best to answer. Oh wait, you're supposed to have a microphone. Yep.
So we do need to use a mic because we have
the mic.
People zooming in.
Yeah.
So before we go to questions, would you talk just a moment about your work with the Peace Academy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can. Yeah. So the Peace Academy was an attempt to create a alternative school in town that the curriculum is designed around peace, creating peaceful kids growing up. There's been a bunch of summer programs, but there's still sort of hope to create a campus based on that. And it's sort of spearheaded by Noha Kokela, a big family in town, and it's had Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, all people involved. Yeah, go ahead.
No.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay, somebody else.
Yeah.
Steve.
Given that Iran is such a part of this puzzle, do you think there's any way that we can get Iran to stop supplying all these arms? Because they don't seem to like it unless we show huge strength, and we don't seem to want to do that.
Yeah. So okay, Iran's an interesting player here. I'll put out there, I'm an Iran skeptic. I don't think they're as big a deal as most people think. I know I am somewhat alone in that analysis, but Iran is the head of the Shia world. Hamas is Sunni. There are no natural allies there at all. Now, Iran is so isolated because of the sanctions that they will sell arms to anyone. I mean, anyone. And Palestinians are so isolated because of the blockade, they will buy arms from anyone. And so, yes, Iran is supplying Hamas, but they're not doing it because they're ideological brothers. They're doing it because Iran can't sell to anyone else and Hamas can't buy from anyone else. Iran, to kind of understand their rhetoric against Israel, you need to understand the internal politics of Iran. And Iran is very smart. Like, they are not dumb people, you know, and they know there's zero chance of them attacking Israel. Zero. Israel's nuclear weapons, Iran's right there, zero chance. They're not dumb. So why are they being so bellicose against Israel? It sells well in Iranian politics. You know, they know they're never going to attack them, and so you might as well just say the, you know, most extreme thing you can, because people are like, yeah. So I don't think Iran is really a threat to Israel, because the only way to make that case is to say Iran is irrational and illogical. And if you look at the leadership there, they've all been, not all of them, but a lot of them have been trained in Western schools and Western political science. They're not dumb. They're not going to attack Israel. Will they continue to supply weapons to Hamas? They'll continue to supply weapons to anybody who buys them. And so I don't think they're going to respond at all to more sanctions, because they're already sanctioned as much as you can sanction them. So I don't see them playing as big a role. I don't think, and right now the reality is Eastern Syria is just a no man's land. I mean, it's the Wild West, and all the weapons are, being filtered through there, and whether they come from North Korea or Russia or Iran, it doesn't matter. Once they get there, or the U.S., yeah. Once they get to Syria, then they're just getting smuggled in. So I recognize as an analyst, I'm not alone in thinking that Iran isn't as big a deal. The other thing is, you have to go to American internal politics. It's great to trump up Iran's threat, because scared Americans vote for you. And so I get really skeptical when it's in everyone's interest to be bellicose, and yet the underlying fundamentals suggest it's not going to happen. Yeah.
So we see a lot of media images of what's going on in Gaza. How much of Gaza is destroyed, like percentage-wise? Is it very small pieces and there are safe parts, or is it basically destroyed?
It's gone.
So how long
something
can
like
the war
2/3
really
of all
last?
houses are gone in Gaza. The one safe spot is Rafah in the south, and Netanyahu, he has to attack it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's where the only thing is, and then he's like, "Oh, go where? There's no place left." I mean, what's going to happen is they're going to circle back to Gaza City, because Egypt. So a blockade only works if you control 4 sides. Israel only controls 3 sides. They don't control the south. That is Egypt. Why is Egypt not providing aid? Because remember, Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the opposition force in Egypt. So al-Sisi does not want to support Hamas, because that would be feeding his main opposition group in Egypt. And so al-Sisi has to give rhetoric that he's pro-Palestinian people but he wants Hamas to fall. And so he's not going to allow many people in. He's not going to let many people into Egypt. And so it's going to be a disaster in Rafah. Because there's no place to go. And that's the only place left. And Netanyahu can't stop the war because he loses his power. So I read there's 2 million people in Rafah alone right now, and they were 200,000 before the war. And but everybody just kind of funnels down there. And the other thing about in Gaza City in particular, there were so many tunnels underneath that you could find some place to avoid it. Rafah is not like that. Rafah has never been a real Hamas stronghold in the same way. And the tunnels there were mostly for smuggling under the border, not for safe. So yeah, no, it's going to be a mess. And I mean, war's stupid. You're just going to destroy all this stuff, and then what's going to happen? They're going to spend 2 years digging it all up, and then they're going to rebuild. And everybody knows what's going to happen. The UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia are going to provide billions of dollars to rebuild everything that was just destroyed in 3 weeks. It's just going to happen. Now, not to be cynical on it, unemployment in Gaza is around 60%. There are going to be a lot of construction jobs in the next 4 years. Better or worse, war is good for the economy. Rebuilding is also good for the economy. So maybe it is a pathway out, and maybe they can rebuild better and actually have a viable state of some kind. But it won't happen with Hamas there, and Hamas has no incentive to give up. So. Okay, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I have a question. I thought I saw something on social media a little bit ago where a lot of countries in the UN voted on whether to send aid into Gaza. And like a lot of, including like the US, either voted like no or like abstained from voting. And I guess my question is there any hope of like sending support to like innocent people while also like not supporting Hamas for like countries?
Yeah, so that's the hard part, right? Is how do you show compassion and real material support for innocent people when the government is in control of everything and you want to eliminate that government? And it's just, it's just such a, it's a hard element. I mean, the reason why the founders of Hamas are billionaires is there's been a ton of aid sent to Palestine, and most of that, not most, a significant portion of that aid went into their pockets. And so what the aid groups are trying to do is how do you isolate Hamas and get supplies to the very needy people? Hamas could give up and aid would go in to everybody. Hamas has no interest in helping the Palestinian people right now. Hamas has the interest of outraging the international community enough so that they put pressure on Israel. That's their strategy. So so it's a really tough situation. But I mean, and then all the aid would come in through Egypt, and the Egyptian government doesn't want to prop up Hamas either. So it's tough. Yeah.
So being that this is a campaign year, how long is America, United States, going to support Israel when Gaza's gone?
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. So the biggest supporters of Israel are evangelical Christians, base of the Trump party. So they'll always support no matter what. Their basis is Jesus isn't coming back until Jews have annexed the West Bank and returned. And so that's a religious belief. Now, of course, all Jews are going to hell, but nonetheless, Jesus comes back. So that side will always. Biden has a much more difficult scenario because there is much more mixed support. Certainly, Jews are by and large Democrats, and an important financial base in particular. But young people are very sensitive to injustices and are widely in support of Palestinians. And so he's got to kind of balance that a lot more. And Biden's in a more difficult position because he can't lose the. I mean, okay, let's be honest. Young people don't vote. They never vote. Like at one point, who cares about young people? But I mean, it's sad, but that's just true. Like young people don't vote. But he can't lose the 20s and 30s. Like young 20s, it doesn't matter, they don't vote. But later 20s and 30s, they want to vote. And so he's going to try to navigate that. We support Israel, but we're going to use our support to try to help the everyday Palestinian people while isolating Hamas. That's his dilemma, which is really hard to do. Yeah.
Who else has questions? I think, Bill, you started with something. No? Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Bill was just noting it's not super hopeful. Sorry, was this billed as a hopeful talk? Sorry. Yeah.
Mark just alluded to or asked the question of how long politically the United States will continue to support Israel. I guess my question is, and I'm becoming more skeptical, but does the United States support the Jewish nation? In my mind, it was somehow in our financial interest to do so. So, I mean, what's the ideology?
Yeah, I mean, so why does U.S. support Israel? I mean, on the one hand, it's the one stable country in that region. So, at least has been until recently. It's democratic. I mean, there's almost nobody else there. They are very integrated into the American economy. Israeli companies are on a cutting edge. But also, there's always been a moral argument, right? The Holocaust or Shoah was a moral disaster. And I mean, come on, we should learn that Jews have been persecuted time and time again. It wasn't a one-off, right? And so we should support the oppressed, the ones who are persecuted. So, I mean, I think there is a rich argument for why to support it. But Biden and every administration has been in this difficult position because what happens when this country we support elects Netanyahu again and again and again? And Netanyahu, so yeah, one aspect just quickly to understand Netanyahu. Netanyahu's coalition, because everything's a coalition in Israel, are a bunch of the absolute idealists, right? They're the ones who want all of Israel, right? And so Netanyahu will never support a two-state solution. But his argument from when he was in power in 1996 is there is no partner for peace on the Palestinian side. Like, let's say we had a Palestinian state. Who's the head of it? Hamas? Fatah? Islamic Jihad? Like, there's no. And so he has supported Hamas over the years because he needs the Palestinians divided to make the argument that we can't give the Palestinians a state because they don't have leadership. And so he is in a symbiotic relationship with Hamas, and so he will, every time Hamas starts to weaken, he'll allow stuff to get through. He wants to prop up Hamas because that hurts Fatah. Now, Hamas needs Netanyahu because Hamas is like, Palestinians, we shouldn't try to make peace with the Israelis because they're not to be trusted. They're horrific people. Case in point, Netanyahu. If the Israelis elected someone from the Labor Party who is like, hey, we're all humans and we should coexist and let's have a two-state solution, Hamas's rhetoric is lost. So Hamas and Netanyahu have needed each other over the last 17 years and played off each other. And so America, like, how do you support Israel and isolate Netanyahu? How do you support the Palestinian people and isolate Hamas? You know how to do that, you should, become Secretary of State. But it's a mess of a situation because any sort of fair-minded analyst will point out, like, there's no peace with Hamas, there's no peace with Netanyahu, and yet they're the representatives of the two parties involved.
My biggest issue has been the amount of money that I used to work for a Jewish senator, and he took a hell of a lot of money from Jewish PACs. He can't vote for a peace treaty because he'll lose his financing. How much does that play into our politics, is our own domestic politics?
Yeah, so just as Netanyahu needed war to make Israelis scared because he's the I'll keep you safe candidate, and Hamas needs war because they want the Palestinians thinking there's no way to make peace. So when we look at the internal politics here, there's an incentive there's a whole machine to help out. I think 20 years ago, especially the Jews in America were sort of universally, blanketedly pro-Israel. And so if you were a senator, you needed to be sort of that same way. There is way more nuance in Israel. Like, I mean, I have so many Israeli friends who are strong advocates for peace and strong advocates against the settlements, and there's just way more diversity in Israel than was allowed here. Over the last 10 years, though, if you see Jewish polls, there's a much more nuanced view, in part because they see how many Israelis are standing up to Netanyahu over the Supreme Court deal. And so, yes, I mean, I think if you see a poll something like, should the Jews have one place in the world where we're free of persecution? Well, I don't know why anybody is against that. right? So those sort of polls, even if they say, are you Zionists, everybody should say that. But should the Palestinians have a state, or can we, should do the rights and livelihood of Palestinians matter, especially among young Jews? That's really shifted. Like young Jews have shown way more diversity and nuance in that recently. So I think there was a time when Jews were kind of like blanketed. You can't say anything negative against the government of Israel, and that's shifted over the last decade. And most of the Jews on our campus are kind of anti-Netanyahu, pro-Israel. Let's find a way to make peace. And do we really, is this really a proportional response?
So does it mirror our own politics currently?
Well, our own politics are weird because both Republicans and Democrats are pro-Israel for different reasons, So I think in some, especially among the Democrats, there's more diversity than there was before. But frankly, it's just so unnuanced. My son's a freshman at Western Washington, and I was talking to him the other day. He goes, "Dad, are you boycotting Starbucks?" And I was like, "Yeah, let's boycott Starbucks. Their coffee sucks. I hate their coffee.
And it's too expensive."
And I was like, he's like, "No, it's not their coffee." I go, "Well, I mean, they're kind of anti-union. If you want to be pro-union, I could see boycotting them, and that might be a good reason." He's like, "No, it's not that." And I was like, "Is it just like anti-corporation? Because I'm all for the local coffee shop." And then he's like, "No, Dad, they support Israel." And I'm like, "You're boycotting Starbucks because they support Israel?" I mean, I don't even know if that's true that they support Israel, but I don't think Starbucks is going to solve this conflict. And he's like, "Yeah, I tell everybody on my floor it's stupid." And I was like, well, maybe you should tell them to study the conflict a little more rather than like it. But it's just so much of the discussion that happens around this is just not very nuanced.
Everything's a little more nuanced, but our media doesn't allow nuance to have a voice.
Yeah. No, I mean, but that's when, people are, if anyone tells you they have a solution to the conflict and they're going to tell you it in the next 60 seconds, they don't. I mean, there's no 60-second solution to this, right? And if so oftentimes among students, they'll be like, "Oh, well, isn't it just X?" And I was like, no, it's never just X. It's like X, Y, Z, A, B, and C, and B is against Z, and gosh, it's just like, I mean, it's been going on for 100 years. If there's a simple solution, somebody would have found it. And George Mitchell, who's solved the Ireland conflict, he has this great quote where I think it was President Bush, it might have been Obama, that asked him to look at the conflict and see like the solution. I mean, he'd solved the other big major conflict, and he said, I spent a year on it and I retired because I can't figure it out. It's just, there's not an easy solution.
So is there, since we try to make a focus of these forums on justice, is there a pathway that you would suggest for members of our congregation that are interested in trying to effect change? Is there a particular pathway that you would suggest we take?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one, I would say educate yourself about it, as you are spending your pre-Super Bowl day educating about it. But then also, like, I tend to want to encourage people to see the best in the other side and to find the common values. Like, can we be just like, killing innocent people is bad?
Yeah.
I mean, can we all just agree on that? Can we agree that like destroying a bunch of people's homes and then rebuilding them is a really dumb thing? I mean, can we agree that every kid should be able to go to school without fear of being shot or bombed? Like, I mean, there's actually some really basic things we all agree on, and that PTSD that's raining. And I think also not forgetting October 7th. I mean, this is a horrific time, and not forgetting that there are 25,000 innocent Gazans that have died too. And we should hold compassion and space for those Israelis that were targeted, and we should hold compassion and space for the Palestinians that are caught in the middle. Because in all this political drama, it's the everyday people who are just losing it. Oh. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's lots of organizations trying, and kudos to all of them. So, yeah. Yeah. But I think educating yourself and then trying to steer conversations to the common values, because I write a lot of articles in the paper, and not everybody agrees with them. Suggest my email box. But I mean, I try to foster understanding, and I know you can't mention everything all the time, but I think and maybe we'll end with this, is that I wrote an editorial a few weeks ago on this, that I think the most powerful way to move this forward is if you find yourself particularly sympathetic to the Palestinian side, criticizing Hamas. If you find yourself sympathetic to the Israeli side, criticizing Netanyahu, like I don't think it's an effective pathway forward when you spend all your energy attacking the worst of the other side. Like, yes, you're Palestinian and you hate Netanyahu. Nobody who's potentially voting for Netanyahu cares what you think. So if you're on the Israeli side, you have to be the voice looking at your own side, saying, this is an obstacle to peace. And if you're on the Palestinian side, you need to be a voice on your own side saying, we've got problems on our side too. When we're just taking the worst example of the other side and spending our energy dedicated to that doesn't move anyone forward. So, and then I think for all people to foster understanding, I think that's part of it. So, cool. Well, thanks for coming. And now we can all agree on the 49ers.